Final Fantasy VII Rebirth sales are apparently not doing very well. However, it's an ongoing conversation. I wanted to bring this up because it is something that I'm noticing with various conflicting reports, let's say, online. However, a lot of it hinges on digital sales versus physical. We have GamesIndustry.biz's Christopher Dring mentioning that Rebirth sales are down 30% physically compared to Remake back in 2020. Only in the UK, though. Physical sales in Japan... Sorry, I said that the 30% is what's down in the UK. Sales are also down in Japan, but we're still dealing with physical stuff. In Japan, 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake sold around 700,000 units in its first week. Final Fantasy 16 then sold 336,000, so it was a whole thing that was then debated across last year as to whether 16 was a bomb or a failure or whatever. Apparently, in the end, internally, it was just referred to as it's fine. It did okay, could have done better, could have done worse, it was all right. But that was 336,000, which is in itself less than half of Remake. And then now Rebirth has sold less than that at 262,000 units. But again, it's all physical sales. And so we haven't got the digital stuff at all. However, if you look at the way that the best-selling games were represented on the PlayStation Store, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth did get the number 2 slot in the US and Europe behind Helldivers, and that was within like a day. It released on the last day of February, and it shot all the way up to number 2. So there's a bit of a disparity between how badly it's doing physically and assumedly how well it's doing digitally. And there's a whole thing with Sony don't really release their digital numbers unless they have something to sing about. So that's an ongoing thing. However, I wanted to throw in, this is just something I was looking at last week, the trophy data for this game. Like, if you look at the amount of people that finished Remake, only 34% of people actually got through that last chapter. And if you look at the current trophy data for Rebirth, even the people that are picking it up, 50% of people have dropped off after chapter 4. Like, of 14 chapters. And we're only a week in. But it's Final Fantasy, for F's sake. Like, it's one of the biggest IPs, one of the most diehard, dogged fandoms. I do think there's a conversation brewing here as to the approach for the remake, the way, how dragged out a lot of the game is. And I think some of that is seen in the sales. Like I said, I think it's an ongoing thing. I just think it's interesting in terms of where we're at the minute.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm a little bit conflicted on this myself. I always feel compelled to defend it because I'm with you and I understand everything you just said. But yeah, to me, 30% down on physical sales, I am confident that will be made up by digital sales compared to the original game.
It's worth saying that 90% of all sales in the UK are digigal overall.
Yeah, so that's it, right? Like you mentioned, you know, it was number 2 on the PS Store after only a couple days of release. You know, if we can argue if that number in total will be an underperformance for a game called Final Fantasy VII. I think that is definitely worth talking about. But also when it comes to like the trophy data as well, again, it's another area where I understand
we talk about this loads.
We absolutely do, but I always cut it some slack because I think, and I mean this in the nicest way, a percentage of the gaming population are freaks like us who will put 50 hours into something in week 1, even if it is as big as Final Fantasy.
You can see like, people didn't even finish their first fight. Like the stuff that should be 100% is never 100%.
That's it, right? So, you know, the trophy data stuff, I think in a year's time, I think the direct comparisons will be interesting then because, people might be dropping off. It's a big game. From what I've heard from you, it sounds like there's a lot of filler in there. Like, I would understand if people dropped off. It's just, with all this data, maybe I'm cutting them too much slack, but I feel like it's almost too early to tell. You know, it's only been out a week and a bit. And I'll be interested to see going forward. I do think overall it's interesting to watch those declining sales in Japan because, you know, even something like Final Fantasy 16, that was only last year where digital sales were just as... important, and that was also just a PlayStation 5 exclusive like this game is, so there's definitely comparisons to be made there, and I do think, like, I don't know, from the sounds of it, from the reviews that this game is getting, from it being the second part of Final Fantasy VII's Remake trilogy, I did personally expect it to be a bit higher, but I don't think the sales are disastrous.
I'm just curious about it. Like, if you look at the history of Final Fantasy sales in Japan especially, they used to sell millions for the original titles. There was a huge drop-off after Final Fantasy 13, but there's also that whole thing about the shift in the market, the access to digital copies, and the fact that physical is more easily tracked than digital overall. But you can point to the general lack of interest in Final Fantasy in Japan, or the general lack of interest in PlayStation in Japan after Sony moved their HQ to San Francisco, or they moved it out of Japan. And so I think there's an interesting thing there where like if Final Fantasy isn't hitting in Japan, it feels like this massive deal. But in terms of just raw sales data and raw unit sales, Remake sold better in other territories anyway, like in the West. You can argue it's geared more towards a Western audience anyway. Like they've got away from turn-based combat. They're giving you this more Devil May Cry style thing, which is what 16 doubled down on, which then sold better in the West overall. Like you can see them aiming for a different audience, and that probably will pay off in the digital sales. However, yeah, I'm curious how it all plays out. And in general, the conversation around Rebirth, yes, the review scores are high, but the stuff that I'm seeing is people going, how the hell are they this high?
Right.
So I'm just curious. I haven't finished it yet. I'm on chapter 12. I'm about halfway through it. I've got a couple more chapters to go. And I'm just curious how it all feels holistically. But something feels really fishy with the way this whole thing's rolling out.
This might sound stupid, right? Because I played middle chapters of games before that I know are middle chapters where you know more is probably coming. I mean, Gears of War 2, one of my favorite games ever. Metal Gear Solid 2, one of my favorite games ever. But there's something about Rebirth very specifically being the middle part of something that already exists and I know will have a proper end in a few years. That, to me, as a sort of non-fan, even though I've loved Final Fantasy VII Remake, like it feels more inessential. It feels like I don't have to be playing it right now and smashing through the story.
That's a really good point, yeah.
In a week. It feels like it's something I can get to almost whenever, especially in like this month, which is absolutely flushed with games, and coming off last month, which was flushed with games as well. Like I find myself more drawn to Dragon's Dogma 2 than I do Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, even though I'm excited to play both.
I think they would counteract that with all the big Aerith stuff. Like it was on the front of the Washington Post. Like they were trying to hang the whole thing on get through the game because something's going on with the story, and like it's the most iconic plot twist in gaming history, and like it's gaming's Vader's Luke's father moment, everything else. That's why I'm getting through the damn thing to see what the hell they've done. I think they've tried to hang it on that. I do agree with you though that there is that feeling of like, well, it's fundamentally a middle space between two bookends that are more plot focused. Even though a lot happens in the middle chunk of 7, it isn't the intro or the outro. So maybe that's a factor as well. I just think that the way that it's rolled out, for me, that 34% of people finishing the first one, that's a big deal. And I remember when that game came out, a lot of people didn't even realize that the game was split, that it wasn't the full game. Like it's called Final Fantasy VII Remake, and then it cuts off after the intro. So I wonder if there's more of a disdain, there's more of a general conversation from the average gamer who isn't that vocal about it, just going, I'm all right, I don't need this.
I think there probably is, I mean, Final Fantasy VII, for as much as I loved it, like I can see why people would go, I don't necessarily need more of that right now.
The end of it is ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, I love the
it.
end.
I'm along for the ride.
But yeah, it's
good Lord.
It's not. In what is a great way for me, it's not the Final Fantasy VII Remake that perhaps a lot of people wanted. And again, this might be my own personal perception. I'm not even saying the game is reflective of this, just from an outsider looking in, weighing up all of the games. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth kind of feels like, an important MCU installment, but not Avengers Endgame. Like whatever the trilogy capper is, that will, to me, feel more like an Avengers Endgame of I need to see what this is. Whereas this seems like, again, in a good way, like Spider-Man No Way Home, which is still big, but it's not Avengers Endgame.
That's true, but I also think, I don't know what you've seen on your particular algorithmic feed, but I don't feel like word of mouth is strong. I feel like critical reception was strong, whereas people getting hands-on are like, oh, this is bloated as hell. There's so many mini games. The open world design is horrible. This thing feels ancient. And I'm very much saying that myself anyway, so maybe that's why I'm getting a lot of that stuff. But I feel like now that people are starting to play it, they're noticing the negatives far more than the positives.
Right.
And I think that might also be like, hurting word of mouth. Maybe I'm not seeing hardly anything. Like if I compare launch weeks, look at how much Helldivers 2 was everywhere. Elden Ring was everywhere. Like these huge titles that dominate. I don't feel like Rebirth is dominating. It's kind of just there. And that might be what you said about people who are just going to get there over time. But it is a bit fishy. I just feel like the whole thing's a bit weird, and I feel like when we finally get eyes on the digital sales, or just more sales over time, it might be more like 16, where it just settles as a divisive installment in an otherwise veteran franchise. Because 16's tail has been people going like, well, I either loved it or whatever. Yeah. I'm in the loved it camp, but like I just wonder with like, this is just maybe the way this is going to go.
It's interesting in that regard because I wonder how much of it is like an algorithm thing, because I personally, again, seen more chatter about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth than I did 16, but that could just be like from who I follow or whatever, the type of people who are maybe loving the game or maybe hating the game. So in that way, it doesn't feel any bigger or, well, it does feel a little bit bigger, but it doesn't feel less than a 16 or it certainly feels less than Remake, which definitely felt like, oh my God, this game is finally here.
Yes.
And we get to play it. But yeah, it's going to be interesting, I think, looking at the sales, looking at the trophy data, what kind of tail this game ultimately has, because like you said, 36% completion rate for Final Fantasy VII Remake. In my eyes, that's not a dreadful completion rate. When we were talking about this before starting, I was looking at what I would describe as similar games that kind of veer between, like 30 and 46 or something. So it's not well under, but if that drops for Rebirth, I do think we're having a problem. And I do think the approach to the Remake project, then I don't know if it's too late to change it, but if this feels...
Probably they're quite far along.
Yeah, if people are dropping off to an even bigger degree, I think the way that they've expanded the game out ultimately might have been a bad idea if people aren't sticking with it. Like, the content might even be great, but if people aren't sticking with it, was it the right move? I don't know.
That's the thing. If the sales go up and the chapter data stays low, then that's very telling. I mean, I think the first 4 chapters, I think it opens strong, first chapter, and then it languishes for a long time.